The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. Chapter 1. A Strange Disappearance. "Good heavens, man!" gasped Philby. "What has happened to you?" Standing in the doorway to his dining room, a bruised and disheveled young scientist wore the look of one who had just been through unspeakable horror. He just stood there, silently shaking his head. The other men seated round the table echoed Philby's amazement at the appearance of their host, a respected young scientist. As all the guests stared, frozen to their chairs, Philby's mind raced back to the strange events of the week before. That evening, as the scientist's dinner guests were all sitting round the table after one of his regular Thursday dinner parties at his stately home in Richmond, England, the host had captured everyone's attention with a point he was making. To avoid using the scientist's name, let him just be known as Time Traveler. Among the invited guests were George Philby, a mathematics professor, the Time Traveler's closest friend, John Manning, a psychologist, and Oswald Perry, a doctor. The men had been discussing the educational system in England, and when the Time Traveler burst out, "And another thing, they're not teaching geometry correctly in today's schools." "What are you talking about?" asked Philby. "We do an excellent job of teaching math." "I figure that system of math produced fine results with us all," observed Manning, as he waved his arm to include all the educated men present. The Time Traveler raised his hand excitedly. No, you must let me explain." "Go ahead. Tell us what's wrong with the way we learned and are teaching the subject," said Philby, briskly running his fingers through his wiry red hair. "Okay," said the Time Traveler. "First of all, they taught us that a line can be measured only one way, by how long it is, right?" And he drew a straight line across his napkin. "A line has one dimension, its length." "You're right so far," said Dr. Perry. "Now I draw a square," continued the Time Traveler, adding 3 more lines to turn his diagram into a square. "Now how many dimensions does it have?" "2, of course," said Manning. "Everybody knows that," said Philby impatiently. "A flat object has length and width. Get on with it, man." All in good time, the Time Traveler's eyes twinkled as if at some secret joke. Now he continued, holding up his cube-shaped cigar humidor. "How about this cube? How many dimensions does it have?" "Are you putting us on?" cried Perry. "It has 3, of course. Length, width, and thickness." "Do I go to the head of the class?" Perry's blue eyes gleamed behind his glasses. "I'm quite serious," said the Time Traveler. "Length, width, and depth. And that's all they ever teach you in school." His hand slammed the table in anger. "Hold on now," said Manning. "Are you trying to tell us that there's more? That there's another dimension besides length, width, and depth?" "There certainly is. Look at this composite portrait of myself, for starters. 3 sections, right? First I'm 5. He pointed at one section. "Next you see me at 12. And finally here I am, 20 years old. How many dimensions do you see?" "The same 3, of course," said Philby. "The canvas and the frame have length, width, and depth." "Aha," said the Time Traveler, "and that's where you're wrong." "Wait a minute," said Manning. "I think I know what you're getting at. Are you talking about time?" "Exactly," shouted the Time Traveler. "Time. The one factor they always manage to skip in teaching us geometry. Time is the 4th dimension." "But don't you see," said Perry, "the reason they leave it out is quite obvious. Length, width, and depth are dimensions in space. We can move back and forth and up and down in space, but we can't go backwards and forwards in time." "Wrong, wrong, wrong," cried the Time Traveler. "The fact is we can." "What do you mean?" asked Philby, getting up. "I am now walking across the room to this door and back. I can go up and down on a staircase or in a balloon. I can move in space, but I can't move into yesterday or tomorrow." "None of us can." "That," said the Time Traveler quietly, is only your opinion. I've been working on experiments for years, and I can now tell you of my greatest discovery. It's a machine that is capable of taking us into the past or into the future." Everyone at the table laughed. "Impossible, ridiculous, absurd." "Don't laugh, my friends," said the time traveler. "It is not impossible or ridiculous or absurd." "Really? Then how about showing us what you've been doing?" said Manning. "Yes, let's see your experiment," said Philby, "though I fear it's all a bunch of nonsense." The time traveler smiled at his guests and walked out of the room. They heard his footsteps heading down the long passage to his laboratory. Perry looked at the other men. "I wonder what it is he's getting," he asked, puzzled. "Probably some magician's trick," said Manning. Philby said nothing but waited with growing curiosity. Soon his host returned, holding in his hand something that glittered. It was a metallic framework, hardly bigger than a small clock, and very delicately made, with some ivory and some transparent crystalline parts. The time traveler moved a small, 8-sided table over to the fireplace and put the mechanism on it. A shaded lamp standing on the table threw a bright light on the model. The time traveler looked first at his guests and then at the object. "I would like to explain," he began, "that this is the only model of my time travel machine. Notice this twinkling part above this bar, and these 2 levers." "It's beautifully made," said Philby. "It took me about 2 years to complete," said the time traveler. And then, pointing to a kind of saddle, he explained, "This is where the time traveler sits, and these," and he pointed to the 2 small bars, "these 2 little white levers control the time. The first one sends the machine gliding into the future, and this other reverses the motion." All the men got up and gathered round the table for a closer look. "When do you plan to test it out?" asked Perry. "In a few seconds. But first, I want you all to examine everything carefully. Check the table, too. I don't want to waste this model and then have you tell me I'm a quack, for once the machine leaves, it will vanish into the future and disappear." "Are you really going to set it off?" asked Manning. "Yes, I am. No, better yet, you are. Lend me your hand, Manning. This way you can't say it's a fake." The time traveler directed the psychologist to put out his forefingers and push the lever. Everyone in that room saw the lever move, and everyone was absolutely certain there was no trickery. Suddenly, a puff of wind from a model made the lamp flame jump. The little machine quickly swung round, blurred, and resembled a faint ghost of itself, and then it vanished completely. Except for the lamp, the table was bare. Chapter 2. A Late Arrival. "Well, I'll be," said Philby. "Could it be under the table?" asked Manning, bending to check. This made the time traveler laugh. "Come now," said Dr. Perry. "Do you really believe that your contraption has traveled into time?" "Of course I do," said the time traveler. "Otherwise I wouldn't be wasting your time." Manning was trying hard to show that he was not at all upset by this strange disappearance. Coolly, he tried to light a cigar. The trouble was he had forgotten to cut off the tip, and was having difficulty igniting the uncut end. "Do you mean to say that your machine has gone into the future?" he asked between hard, smokeless puffs. "Either the future or the past. I'm not sure which," said the time traveler. "You see, it has not moved through space, only through time. Since it passed through large portions of time in only a second, its appearance thinned out, and it became invisible." "It all seems very believable right now," said the doctor, "but I wonder what we'll think about this tomorrow, when our common sense returns." "Would you like to see the actual time machine itself?" asked the time traveler. Everyone present thought their host must be joking. "What are you saying?" cried Manning. "You can't be serious," added Perry. What a sense of humor, said Philby. Just follow me, said the time traveler, and with the lamp in his hand he led the way down the long, drafty corridor to his lab. The men followed puzzled, not ready to believe until their host flung open the lab door. There before their eyes stood a full-sized version of the little mechanism that had vanished in the dining room. Parts of the time machine were of nickel, parts were of ivory, and parts had been sawed out of rock crystal. The thing seemed to be complete, except for the twisted crystalline bars which lay unfinished on the workbench alongside some drawings. Philby picked up one bar for a better look. "Quartz, isn't it?" he asked. The time traveler smiled and nodded. "Listen now," said Philby to the time traveler. "Are you really serious? Or is this another trick like the so-called ghost you made appear last Halloween?" The time traveler held the lamp high and pointed dramatically in the time machine. "I intend to explore time," he said. "Is that clear? I was never more serious about anything in my whole life." During the following week, Philby ran into the doctor at their club. "What do you think of what we saw last Thursday?" Philby asked. "Well, you know, our scientist friend has always been a bit of a joker. Clever, yes, but it's hard to take him seriously. But how about the way he made the model disappear?" "It was a good trick, all right," said the Dr. Perry with a laugh. "Reminds me of the one I saw performed at a magic show. Can't explain either one of them." "Are you going to dinner with our time traveler again this Thursday?" asked Philby. "I plan to. See you there." Philby arrived late for the time traveler's dinner party that following Thursday and found 4 men already gathered in the drawing room. He recognized Clark, an editor, and Bryce, a writer, in addition to Dr. Perry and Manning. But their host was nowhere to be seen. Perry was standing by the fire, with a piece of paper in one hand and his watch in the other. "It's 7:30, he said. "I guess we'd better go in to dinner." "Without our host?" asked Philby. Perry held up the piece of paper and explained, "He left this note for whoever arrived first. He says he might be detained, and to start off without him at 7 if he wasn't here. Says he'll explain when he comes." "It certainly seems a shame," said the editor, Clark, who looked as if he didn't skip too many meals. The doctor rang the dinner bell, and the men seated themselves round the large oval table. "Wonder why he's late," said Clark. "It could be that he's tripping through time," Philby said jokingly. "What do you mean?" asked Bryce, the writer. "Well, you see," began Manning, "last week he showed us this ingenious trick with a little model of what he called a time machine, and—" The door from the corridor opened slowly and noiselessly. Philby was facing that way and was the first to notice its movement. "At last!" he cried. Then the door opened wider and Philby saw him. "My goodness!" he shouted. Dr. Perry, who was the next to see him, stared in wonder. "Good heavens, man!" gasped Philby. "What has happened to you?" Chapter 3. The Time Traveler's Story. Everybody turned towards the door. There stood the time traveler in a terrible state. His dusty coat had green smears down the sleeves. His hair looked grayer to Philby than he had remembered it. But he couldn't tell if the color had changed, or if it was just the effect of dust. The time traveler's face looked pale as a ghost's. His chin had a half-healed cut on it, and his whole expression was haggard and drawn, as if he'd undergone some intense suffering. He hesitated in the doorway for a minute, as though dazzled by the light, and then he slowly and painfully limped into the room and sat down. Without saying a word, he motioned towards the wine. Clark filled a glass of champagne and pushed it toward him. The time traveler gulped it down, and it seemed to him good, for he looked around the table at his friends, and the ghost of his old familiar smile flickered across his face. "What on earth have you been up to, man?" asked the doctor. Don't let me disturb you, the time traveler said haltingly. He held the glass out for a refill, which he drained. It's good, he said. His eyes grew brighter, and the color began to return to his cheeks. I'm going to wash and dress, he said slowly. Then I'll come down and try to explain what happened. Save me some of that mutton. I'm starving for a bit of meat. He put down his glass and walked towards the door that led to the staircase. Again, Philby noticed his lameness, the soft padding sound of his footsteps. Glancing down, he saw his host's feet as they padded out. There was nothing on them but a pair of tattered socks. They were blood-stained. Philby felt like following him to see if he needed help. Then he remembered how his friend hated to have anyone fuss over him, so he forced himself to return his attention to the dinner table. What's up? Asked Bryce. Has he been playing the amateur beggar? I don't get it. I have a feeling it's got something to do with the time machine, said Philby, and he went on to complete Manning's account of last week's meeting. The new guests' faces showed their complete disbelief at the story of the time traveler. Time travel, said Clark. Did you see that dust on him? Could someone get that way by exploring a scientific theory? Bryce, the writer, joined in laughingly. Aren't there any clothes brushes in the future? And now for an exclusive eyewitness report from our special correspondent in Day After Tomorrow, announced Clark, the editor, and he made a trumpet sound. Just about everybody began to laugh hysterically at the wild idea. At this point, the time traveler returned, dressed in ordinary clothes. Of the change that had so startled his guests earlier, nothing remained but his haggard look. Listen, said Clark, hilariously. These fellows say you've been traveling in the middle of next week. How about telling us your adventures? The time traveler sat down silently and smiled in his old way. Where's my mutton? He asked finally. What about your story? Asked Bryce. Story can wait, said the time traveler. I want something to eat. I won't say a word until I get a bellyful. Just one word? Begged Philby. Have you been time traveling? Yes, he answered, with his mouth full. The rest of the dinner was extremely uncomfortable. No one said anything until the time traveler finally pushed his plate away. I guess I should apologize, he said. I was simply starving. I've had a most amazing time. He reached for a cigar and cut the end. Let's go into the smoking room. It's too long a story to tell over greasy plates. He rung the bell for the servants to start clearing the table and then led the way to the adjoining room. Did you tell them about my machine? He asked Philby, indicating the new guests. Philby nodded. I tried to. But such a thing is an impossibility, cried Clark. I can't argue tonight, said the time traveler. I don't mind telling you the story, but I'm in no shape to argue. I'll tell you what happened to me, but please, no interruptions. No one spoke. I was in my lab this afternoon at 4 o'clock. Since then, I've lived 8 such days as no human being has ever lived before. 8 days in one? How could that be? Asked Bryce. Look, I deeply want to tell you the story, even though I know most of it will sound like I'm lying. But it's true, every word of it. Is it agreed that there will be no interruptions? Agreed, echoed the guests. The time traveler settled back in his chair like a weary old man. The circle of light from a little lamp shone on his white, sincere face, and his voice was filled with emotion as he began to speak. Chapter 4. Landing in the year 802,701 A.D. Most of the listeners were in the shadow, for the candles in the smoking room had not been lit. The small lamp shone on only the speaker's earnest face, on the writer's puzzled face, and on the lower legs of the portly editor. As the time traveler began talking, the men glanced at each other every now and then. After a while, though, they stopped doing that and looked only at the time traveler's face. This, then, is his story in these his very own words. I felt like a man about to die as I got ready to test my machine. It was 10 o'clock this very morning, right down the hall in my lab. I gave the machine one last tap, tried all the screws again, and put one more drop of oil in the quartz rod. Then I seated myself in the saddle. Steady, I told myself, this is it. I took the starting lever in one hand and the stopping lever in the other. Then I pulled over the first and almost immediately the second. I felt myself tremble, and then came that feeling of falling you get in a nightmare. That was all. How long it lasted, I don't know. What's this? I exclaimed to myself, coming awake. Everything in the lab looks exactly the same as before. Hasn't anything happened? It was then that I noticed the clock. Just a moment before, it had stood at a minute or so past 10, and now it was nearly 3:30. It's a success, I told myself. The machine has moved me through fourth dimension, time. I took a deep breath, set my teeth, and this time gripped the starting lever with both hands. The lab got hazy and went dark. I pulled the lever to its extreme position. Night came, and in another moment morning. The lab grew fainter and hazier. The next night came, very black. Then day again, and night again, and day again, and faster each time. I had this sensation of helplessness and confused headlong movement as the lab seemed to drop away from me. I figured the lab eventually had fallen apart along with my house, and I was now out in open air, in the spot where the house used to be. Night continued to follow day, like the quick flapping of black wings. Then I saw the sun hopping swiftly across the sky, leaping in every moment. How fast I'm traveling, I thought, and every minute is marking a day. The twinkling succession of darkness and the light was very painful to my eyes. I saw the moon spinning through its quarters, from new moon to full moon, and I had a faint glimpse of the circling stars. It's amazing that I haven't moved at all through space, I kept telling myself. Actually, I was still on the hillside, which this house now stands. It was time traveling that turned night and day into continuous grayness and made the jerking sun a streak of fire and the moon a faint wavy band. I saw trees growing and changing like puffs of smoke, green, browning, spreading, shivering, and passing away. I saw buildings rise up and faint and fair and then pass like dreams. The hands of my speedometer went even faster. The sun went up and down with such fantastic speed that I knew I was traveling over a year a minute. 1900 AD, 2000, 10,000 AD, 50,000 AD. At first I hardly thought of stopping, and then all kinds of thoughts went through my head. 100,000 AD, 200,000 AD, 500,000 AD. I wondered what's happening to the human race. What marvelous new advances on our simple civilization will I find? Next, I began to worry that something terrible would happen when I landed. What if some new building or other object now stands in the spot my lab used to occupy? Mightn't there be a collision that would blow both me and my machine into the great unknown? Finally, I had enough of wondering, of worrying, and of falling feeling. In a mood of nervous impatience, I hit the stop lever. The date dial stood at 800 2701 AD as the machine went tumbling down and over on its side. To the loud sound of thunder, I was flung out into the air. I think I was stunned for a moment. I found myself sprawled on the grassy lawn in front of the overturned craft. Hail was coming down round me, and it drove about the ground like smoke. Soon I was completely soaked. All I could see through the hazy downpour were clusters of purple rhododendron bushes and huge white marble figures. That's a pretty tall statue, I thought, judging by the birch tree next to it. The tree reaches up only to the statue's shoulder. The statue looked like a sphinx with hovering wings. Its sightless eyes seemed to be watching me. There was a faint shadow of a smile on its lips. The pedestal on which it stood was made of bronze, and it had turned green with age. New worries hit my mind. How has man developed? Has he become cruel and insensitive? What if I seem to them like some old-world savage? What if they think of me as an animal and a foul creature to be killed? As the hail cleared and the blue summer sky appeared, I began to see other vast shapes, huge buildings with tall columns. Panic came over me. I've got to straighten this out and get out of here, I hissed to my machine. Grappling fiercely with it, wrist and knee, I finally got it upright again, but it struck my chin hard in the process and left a deep cut. I was about to mount and take off when my courage came back. I looked around more curiously and less fearfully at this world of the future. High on a wall of the nearest building was a round opening. Inside the opening, several figures dressed in rich, soft robes were watching me. Then I heard voices coming from another direction and saw some men running from the bushes by the white sphinx. One of these men took a pathway leading straight to the little lawn on which I stood with my machine. He was only about 4 feet tall and was dressed in purple tunic and leather sandals. His soft blonde hair curled round his face. He struck me as being beautiful and graceful, but delicate. His flushed face made me think of illness rather than of health. "This creature is no threat to me," I said. My confidence now returned. The young man came right up to me without any fear and laughed into my eyes. Then he turned and spoke in very strange but sweet-sounding language to the two who were following him. They too laughed. I let them come closer and touch my hand. Then they ran their pink fingers on my coat. They seemed to want to make sure that the giant they faced was real. But when they began to touch the time machine, I made a warning gesture. I said. "Off limits. That's my return ticket from your playland." That reminded me of a danger I had forgotten all about. The time machine must not be operated by anyone else while I was away from it. Better not take any chances, I told myself. I reached over the bars of the machine and unscrewed the little lever that would get it started. These I put safely in my pocket.